is always food and coffee across the street at the club. And we have also lunch is going to be served, self-service like buffet style. And we will begin our session today with Professor Claudia Ringler from the International Food Policy Research Institute, and she will give us first an introduction about the panel.
Yeah. Thank you very much, and I trust you will keep us on time.
I will.
Good. Yeah, so basically the origin of the session was the fact that we have growing water shortages, growing water scarcity, degradation, pollution, etc. At the same time, still a large share of the global population that is not served by water. And a large share of the population that still lacks access to water for food, actually to produce food, which is a growing challenge under climate change. But the focus, to address these challenges remains very much on the technology side. And of course, technologies are fundamental. Innovation has been driving agriculture growth, overall economic growth. But at the same time, there's an increasing recognition that we also need the confluence, and this is why we have the title. We need a confluence of these technologies with both policies and institutions. And this confluence becomes more important the further we move up in complexity of technologies, technologies that require that many farmers work together, cooperate, and also when we have the confluence of state and market actors. And the presentations that we have today here basically cover the entire spectrum. We start with smallholder agriculture, individual irrigation technologies, focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. So looking at the constraints that these farmers face and what technologies, but also policies and institutions can do. Then we moving beyond just the technologies. How can we change technologies, and what else is needed to actually get women's perspectives into the water for food debate, and also to improve nutritional outcomes. So move beyond just agriculture for food security to agriculture for food and nutrition security. The third talk moves it even further, a little bit higher up, when we talk about the need for collective actions and institutions to address groundwater depletion, which is one of the main challenges in South Asia today. So again, what can be done, and actually sometimes technologies bring us into larger, adverse environmental impact challenges such as this groundwater depletion. And so again, what's the role of institutions, and maybe institutions and technologies to address that? And finally, at a yet larger scale, to address this growing water scarcity challenges, especially water for food, there's now a growing drive to institute public-private partnerships, to bring in a lot of the investment and the know-how to increase water for food availability. But again, there's a lot of institutional challenges associated with that we will address. And I think, will you introduce the speakers? Then I will not say anything about that. Yeah, thanks. And I'll hand back to our chair. At the same time, I'll open the first presentation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And today we have our first panelist is Meredith Jordano. Meredith, Ms. Jordano is a principal researcher and advisor for research strategy and management at the International Water Management Institute. She's responsible for both research and research strategy functions at the IWMI. During her tenure at the IWMI, Meredith has co-managed collaborative research and outreach on small-scale agricultural water management in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. And today, she is going to speak, as you can see in her presentation, about unlocking the potential for smallholder agriculture in Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. Meredith.
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. As you mentioned, my name is Meredith Giordano. I'm with EMI, and I'm based here in Washington, D.C. And I'll start our series of presentations looking at agricultural water management solutions as a way to unlock the potential for smallholder agriculture, particularly focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia. I'll start with just a brief background to the research that underpins the presentation that I'll give, and then really focus more on the key messages that have come out of that work, some of the investment opportunities that we see for supporting smallholder agricultural water management, and then just end with a few concluding remarks. So to begin, in terms of the background, what I'm presenting builds on a body of research that EME and a number of other organizations, many of them here, have been involved in over the past several years, where we've looked at identifying agricultural water management solutions by examining water within the larger context of rural livelihoods. And we've done this at a local scale, a watershed scale, national, and in a regional context. And what we mean by that is looking not only at access to water resources, but also looking at the profitability of different interventions to support agricultural water management, the policies and institutions that govern these interventions, how these interventions link with the market systems, both input markets and output markets, how they fit within the resource and livelihood situations in which they're introduced, locally, regionally, nationally, and also what are the different externalities or impacts, both positive and negative, that come out of large-scale adoption of these different interventions. We define a solution, an AWM solution, to be a technology, a practice, an institution, and or a policy, because often it's the combination of all of them that come together, that contribute to smallholder livelihoods, that benefit women and men, that they're cost-effective to implement, they're suitable for outscaling, and they address resource sustainability issues. So let me just go through some of the key messages, and I think we're going to come back to a lot of them in the subsequent presentations. We'll go into more depth on many of them. First of all, one of the key messages is just how large this agricultural water management, smallholder ag water management sector really is. It's vibrant, it's growing. In India, more than half, well over half of the irrigated area is watered by smallholder pumps. In many African countries, smallholder agricultural water management reaches more farmers than public irrigation. If we look at Ghana, for example, we can see that smallholder agricultural water management reaches more farmers and irrigates more area than the formal irrigation schemes. And this is a similar pattern in many other countries that we were looking at. Secondly, smallholder agricultural water management, it provides incomes when farmers need it most, particularly in the dry season. In Madhya Pradesh, in India, we found that decentralized rainwater harvesting, it offers dry season cropping opportunities, other livelihood opportunities for farmers. And in the studies we were looking at, it increased incomes by more than 70%. In Burkina Faso, smallholder farmers that had access to small reservoirs could grow vegetables. They could also use it for their rice production. And there again, we saw significant increases in their dry season incomes as a result. In Tanzania, where farmers were developing community-managed river diversions, we found that yields were increasing, incomes were increasing on par with many of the formal irrigation schemes. Smallholder agricultural water management, I think a really important message is that farmers are already investing in a lot of these technologies themselves. It's not just coming from external sources. These technologies exist, adoption rates are increasing, and investment costs are typically low and profit margins are typically high. In some of the modeling work, we looked at scenarios going forward. We also see a lot of potential for smallholder agricultural water management going forward. Investments in, for example, motorized pumps in smallholder in sub-Saharan Africa could benefit up to 185 million people. It could generate revenues of up to $22 billion annually. In Tanzania alone, you could see benefits of up to 2 to 4 million people, or about 12% of the rural population. But there are a number of risks from just, from the upscaling, and we need to be cognizant of what those risks are. There are challenges related to equity, efficiency, and sustainability. So in some of the studies we did where we looked at access for men and women to different technologies, we found that women generally tend to adopt more manual systems, whereas men tend to adopt more of the mechanized systems, such as motorized pumps. This is an example from Zambia. There are market inefficiencies that negatively affect farmer decision-making and technology access. In Zambia, for example, we did a survey of the same make and model of a pump in one urban sector, and there was a significant price variation. So if you don't have knowledge of where to purchase something, you could be disadvantaged. And we'll come back to sustainability issues, I think, later on. This is if the uncontrolled spread of small-scale AWM can lead to environmental damage. And here's one very well-known example from India where overpumping has led to the decline in the groundwater tables in parts of India. We also find that smallholder agriculture lacks an institutional home. Many of the formal irrigation or public agencies to support irrigation aren't really set up for this different form of irrigation development, this smallholder development. And as a result, a lot of the actors involved in smallholder are outside the water sector, they're fragmented, and that impacts collective bargaining for the farmers themselves. We found through this whole range of studies a whole number of pathways, though, that we feel that if investments, targeted investments, could help address some of these potential constraints and help this smallholder agricultural water management sector achieve its potential. I won't go through all of these, but just at the top line, several pathways include increasing access to water, catalyzing smallholder value chains, creating synergies across different policies and different sectors, and taking a watershed perspective. And I'll just give an example of each just to give a flavor of some of the different investment opportunities that we see. First of all, in terms of investing in water storage, there's high demand for this. It increases resilience for farmers who have access to water in the dry season. I already mentioned the Madhya Pradesh case already, where farmers were investing in on-farm ponds to harvest rainwater. This gave them access to both wet and dry season farming. Cropping intensity increased, incomes increased. It gave opportunities for other livelihood options for those farmers. It reduced groundwater use as well as electricity use for the need to pump the groundwater. For the farmers that invested in these structures, they experienced a payback period of 3 years and a positive benefit-cost ratio. Another investment opportunity is investing in value chain improvements. We saw examples of irrigation service providers in parts of India and parts of Africa, and this is something we see that could be scaled up, where a local entrepreneur would own one or more pumps, and they would provide irrigation services to farmers. It would provide income for entrepreneurs, and it would provide access to technologies for farmers to grow dry season crops. A third area for investment is creating these policy synergies. Sometimes these solutions are outside of the water sector, and if we look for opportunities that bridge these sectors, we can find some interesting and innovative opportunities. We're looking, for example, at India, where there's quite a large promotion program of solar pumps for groundwater. But a lot of those pumps are being promoted through capital subsidies. What we're looking at is an alternative promotion package where solar power could be treated as a cash crop, where farmers could sell back their excess solar power to the utility grid. It would reduce the financial cost for those subsidies. It would give incentives for farmers to sell back that excess power that's generated rather than using it to pump more groundwater. And it could be more environmentally beneficial. And then the last thing is just the importance of investing in a watershed or a broader perspective, looking at the benefits and the costs from a social, economic, and environmental perspective, from scaling up different technologies or multiple technologies at the scale of a watershed, so that future benefits could be enhanced. So just to conclude, we see that supporting smallholder agricultural water management makes economic sense. I think very importantly, it leverages something that farmers are already doing themselves. The scale of the trend is large, but the potential is even greater. And there are a whole lot of opportunities we see to invest in this area that combine technologies, institutions, and policies that can leverage these investments that farmers are already making themselves. It can safeguard the proven benefits that the sector is having on food security, poverty alleviation. It can extend the benefits to other groups, and it can hopefully address some of the adverse environmental impacts that we've seen along the way. Thank you. Thank you.
We will hold the Q&A at the end, but in case there is like a question or clarification right now, we can do it. She's a senior research assistant in the Environment and Production Technology Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute here in Washington, D.C. She has studied both the production and consumption angles of food security with an undergraduate major in international agriculture and rural development from Cornell University and a master's degree in food policy and applied nutrition at the Tufts Friedman School. Today, we'll have her presentation, which is Irrigation, Gender, and Nutrition Linkages, Tapping Irrigation's Potential for Women's Empowerment. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. Today, I'm going to, like Claudia said, go beyond some of the technology questions into how is this actually impacting more social dynamics, and how can irrigation also improve nutrition and health, and what are the linkages between nutrition and health and gender. So I'll start by discussing some of the gender irrigation pathways. I'll talk a little bit about this index we're using called the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index in our research in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Ghana. I'll present some of our findings and talk a bit about some next steps for our research and conclusions. So we have this discussion paper that came out in Global Food Security by our colleague Laia Dominic that highlights 5 hypothesized pathways by which we think gender and irrigation and nutrition are linked. So the first pathway is through agricultural production. So by increasing, like Meredith was saying, agricultural production in terms of quantity and the diversity of foods consumed, we can improve nutrition and health outcomes, especially during the lean season when people need it most. Also, by increasing incomes through that increased production, especially during the lean season, again, we can also improve maternal and child health and nutrition, which can, as we know, as we increase incomes and as we improve women's empowerment, women are more likely to invest in the health and nutrition of their households. So by empowering women, we can also, in turn, improve maternal and child health. Also through a water supply pathway. So by improving water access for a household, we can not only reduce the immense burden women face by going out collecting water for up to 3 hours a day in some contexts, and they could use that time for other purposes or other income generating activities, but it also can improve, and there's a lot of research coming out about how improving the water supply in a household and the water sanitation and hygiene environment can improve child growth much more than we previously thought. So by improving that sanitation and hygiene environment through better water access, maybe we can have compounding impacts on child health. And all of these pathways are also related to women's empowerment. And like I said, as women control more of that income and decision making, we also see impacts for child health and nutrition. And there's also a negative pathway highlighted here that potentially poor water management strategies, such as leaving water open or contaminating it with pesticides, could potentially cause negative impacts through diseases like malaria or other waterborne pathogens. So this is a figure that we've put together, and I see the text is a bit small here, but just to highlight that irrigation and health and gender and nutrition are all linked, and through some of the pathways we already discussed. So I just want to highlight that it's not automatic that agricultural production will have positive impacts for gender, but it's very contextual. So there's a lot of fear that if you add if you add value to something by purchasing a pump, making it more desirable, then the man will automatically control it, like through cash crops or more marketable crops. So it's very contextual, the impacts that this can have with gender, but it's about including women throughout the process from the beginning to make sure they're part of the decision-making process. And this is just to highlight, again, what Meredith said about irrigation can improve outcomes when we need it the most. So during this dry season is actually when we see the worst child growth outcomes, so their height for their age, because of food security issues and income issues. So this pathway for health and nutrition during the dry season is most important. And this is just to highlight this figure on the right shows you that the infection malnutrition cycle. So if you're more sick, if you're undernourished, you're more likely to get sick, and then it's harder for you to recover. So the importance of making sure that water supply is clean, especially if you're using it for domestic purposes. And by including women, again, throughout the process, you can ensure maybe that it'll be more likely that it's used for domestic purposes and that it's clean water. So I'll talk a little bit about our work in Ethiopia, Tanzania, and Ghana on this topic. So IFPRI is working with the Innovation Lab for Small-Scale Irrigation out of Texas A&M University. And we're doing a household survey that looks at some of these linkages. And like I mentioned, we're using the Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index to measure women's empowerment and look at its relationship between gender and health and irrigation. So this index was developed by our organization, IFPRI, as well as some other partners. And it looks at 5 domains of empowerment asked through a household survey module that takes about 40 minutes. And you ask it of both the man and woman of a household, privately and separately. And it looks at these 5 domains: production decision-making, access to resources, control over income, community leadership, and time allocation. And our findings so far in Ethiopia and Tanzania show that we don't see much of a difference in terms of women's empowerment when we separate it out by irrigating and non-irrigating households. In fact, in Ethiopia, we see that irrigators have slightly lower empowerment of women and slightly lower gender parity with their husbands. So we wanted to look into this question a little bit more deeply because this was confusing and we were a little disappointed. So when you look at some of the more plot level analysis, we see a different story. So these are some results from Ethiopia showing that for irrigated plots, we actually see statistically significantly higher joint decision making for irrigated plots. And there's a whole body of research on jointness in agriculture and what that means. And we see actually like a disapproval of the theory that the crops, like cash crops and higher value crops, are more controlled by the man. And in fact, across the board, we see that for irrigating household, plot level decision making on these crops, and even looking at inedible cash crops and fruits and vegetables, is actually much higher. And when we look at the extent to which this decision making is happening and how much input women have, about 85% or more say they have input into some, if not most or all, decisions that are occurring on those plots. And lastly, we do see improvements in food security and dietary diversity, which is a measure of diet quality, in all categories except for women's dietary diversity. We don't see a statistically significant improvement for women's dietary diversity in Ethiopia, but we do for food security, women's dietary diversity, and household dietary diversity in all other cases. So to conclude, we do see some irrigation and gender linkages for sure in our data, though the extent and importance of these differences is still inconclusive, and we still need to continue looking at these questions, and I think continue to look at these plot level data. But we have exciting results so far, and we're also still conducting these analyses, so if you have any suggestions for future research questions to look at, please don't be shy. And as Meredith said in her conclusion also, these relationships are highly complex and they're highly contextual, and intra-household gender dynamics are widely different depending on which context you're looking at. And irrigation is not a one-size-fits-all kind of technology because groundwater availability will vary widely. So yeah, like I said, our next steps are to continue looking at these data and continue looking at these plot and crop level analyses and do some more econometrics type work with our results. So thank you very much. We welcome your questions and comments.
Thank you. Our third speaker is Marco Jensen, who is a professor in the School of Sustainability and the director for the Center for Behavior, Institutions, and Environment, both at Arizona State University. Professor Jensen received his PhD in mathematics from Maastricht University in the Netherlands and holds a master's in operations research from Erasmus University, Rotterdam, also in the Netherlands. His research focuses on the governance and robustness of coupled infrastructure systems, especially with respect to water resources, using agent-based modeling, lab and field experiments, and case study analysis. Much of his work focuses on the conditions in which self-governance of common resources is successful and can be enhanced. Professor Jensen's presentation topic today is building institutions for groundwater governance in Andhra Pradesh, India. Thank you very much.
Thank you. So this is work done by a large group of collaborators from different institutions, and I will present some of the results of a project that is going on now for about 3 years. So the motivation of our work is that that we look at collective action problems related to groundwater, and we would like to help communities to improve their groundwater conditions, and that means that they have to solve collective action problems. We are using experimental games as a tool for improving their collective action opportunities. The reason that we do that is that in our academic research, when we study collective action by using field experiments, we noticed that when we came back that people had changed some of their practices because they, during these experiments that we did, they realized that things could be done differently. And so now we are testing, can we use these experimental games as a way to facilitate collective action. So we do a project, collaboration with 2 Indian NGOs in 29 villages in Andhra Pradesh. And actually, the NGO is expanding this rapidly at the moment. We focus on groundwater games, and we do this in these communities where they were already measuring groundwater levels. So important here is that we are not teaching these communities. We don't say what to do. So our work is very much inspired by the work of Eleanor Ostrom. We are not teaching people what to do. We don't impose policies, but we provide an action situation in which people are, which we provide the opportunity to learn about the problem. So the Foundation for Ecological Security is the main NGO we work with, and so this NGO is also very interested in this using experimental games as a tool. They work in more than 8,000 villages all over India, and they are starting to expand the use of these games in other places and also for other topics than groundwater. So groundwater use in India is a problem that is relatively new, and that's because of the pumps that were mentioned earlier. A lot of pumps, the electricity that are used for these pumps are free for farmers, which doesn't help to reduce the use of the pumps. It's difficult for people to see the consequences of the groundwater, and so there's a disconnect of the actions they take and the long-term consequences. So this is one of the ways these experimental games facilitate their understanding of the problem, because it's difficult to really to see there's a kind of a disconnect in the mental models of their action with the outcomes of their decisions. So we do experiments in each village with groups of men and groups of women, and I will explain the experiment in a minute, but we do in a set of experiments, we do a community debriefing and then a survey household, and we come back 1.5 years later and we collect additional data. So the treatments that we did experiments in 20 villages, and in 9 villages we kept that as a control. So in the typical experiments that we do, we pay people individual amounts based on the decisions they make. That's the typical experimental economics approach. That is not the kind of approach that NGOs will prefer, because they will not like to have people having different amounts of money being paid during these interventions. So we decided to test the effect of this and whether we get similar results or not. So we had 10 villages where the participants got individual payments, and the other 10 villages, the village received a flat fee for participation, which the NGO typically is how they are operating. And so there are no financial incentives for the participants in their decisions. Okay. So the groundwater game is a variation of a typical common pool resource game. We have 5 participants, and we do 2 games of 10 rounds. And the resource is the groundwater. At the start of the game, our 50 units of groundwater are available. And each round, the participants have to make a choice between 2 crops. One is a crop which is a more subsistence crop, lower income and also lower amount of demand. So this is here we see 2 units of income and 1 unit of water it's using. And the other is more a cash crop, and that uses more water but also gets a higher income. So they are, after each round, there will be a recharge. Say it's like rainfall, we have a recharge of the groundwater. That is 5 units. Because we have 5 players, if they all use the crop A, there will be no depletion of the groundwater. If they will all start using B, there will be a decrease of groundwater, because there will not be enough recharge of the groundwater. In the first game, there's no communication, and after the first game, we let people communicate with each other, and that's also what we are interested in. Do they come up with some different solutions among themselves? So this is the kind of how we present the game to the participants. We are showing how the groundwater is declining over time, if that is declining. So we show what will happen if you use B every round by all the participants. Then within 4 rounds, the groundwater is depleted, and there will be no, the game ends. There is a community debriefing at the end of the experiments, in which we discuss the outcomes with the whole community. So this is how the experiment is performed. This is done by the local NGOs. This is a variation of the outcomes. So you see there's a huge variation of the outcomes. Some they maintain the groundwater at a high level, others they over-harvest it in a few rounds. So what are the effects that lead to the different results? How long they have been involved, that the NGO had a effect that the more long they were involved, the less water they used. Education, social capital, a measure of collective action. If they were irrigators of using groundwater themselves, they also use more groundwater in the game. What might be more interesting is that with an insignificant effect, the way we pay the participant had no effect on the outcome. Also, the cost, the gender had no impact. So we went back 1.5 years later to see to try to see whether we can measure any long-term impact. So the preliminary results is that we see that there are changes happening in these communities. It will be hard to precisely tell because we didn't teach a particular approach, so it is difficult then to measure what will be the impact, but we can say something about how they understand the problem, and that's something that we measure mental models, so there is improvement of how they understand the groundwater problem. We see different kind of innovations. For example, we see the increasing use of drip irrigation. And what the NGO is especially focused on, because I say, well, scientifically we have not proven it works, but the NGO say, yeah, but now finally they start putting groundwater on the agenda. So the village leaders, they put this as an important point. So we are now working on new variations of the game. So we play the game and then we ask people to say, what would you change to the game to make it more relevant for your situation? And that lead to inclusion of the quality of for drinking water, and also inclusion of rainfall variability. This is start to be scaled up. Village leaders are trained to play the game with other village leaders, and actually this month they are starting in 3 districts in India to do these games. So this might be to various dozens of villages, and we want to explore some other types of resources. So we hope that these experimental game can lead to some improvement in way people can solve collective action on their local resource problems. It's a neutral place for discussion of collective action problems. And it challenges their mental models of the problem and may improve the mental models of the problem. And so we are developing now also resources for practitioners to use this kind of tools for other resource problems too. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our last speaker of the day of this panel would be Claudia Winkler, who is a Deputy Director of the Environment and Production Technology Division at the International Food Policy Research Institute. She co-leads the Institute's Water Research Program and is also co-manager of the Managing Resource Variability and Competing Uses flagship of the CGIAR research program on water, landscape, and ecosystem. She has more than 100 publications in the area of water management, global food and water security, natural resource constraints to global food production, and the synergies of climate change adaptation and mitigation. And now she will talk about assessing models of public-private partnerships in irrigation development. Thank you very much again.
Yeah. Thank you for the kind introduction. Yeah, this is the last presentation that really brings it to a close, going up from the technologies to the PPPs. So the background here is that this PPP model is becoming increasingly accepted, as one way to finally raise the financing for rural areas in especially in Africa, but also in Asia. And interestingly, we see this model also now being employed in Northern Africa, Spain, Latin America, Bangladesh. So PPPs are really coming up in very rapid succession, very different background reasons. Not all of them might be traditionally be considered a PPP, but a lot of them are just classified. So basically, whenever we have a private sector entity joining, or agreeing with a public sector entity to put some investment into a rural area, with basically the private sector supposedly bringing in the fiscal, like the financial resources that the public sector doesn't have to invest in rural infrastructure. Here we focus on irrigation. The other point is also to bring in the private sector know-how. So, for example, if the smallholder farmers that we've talked about, so now they have irrigation and they have produce or they have products, but the market linkages are not there, the know-how to actually ensure that it is the farmers and not the middlemen to make the money out of the irrigated produce. So there's all these hopes that the private sector can bring all of that in and really basically accelerate rural development. But at the same time, not much has been done on who wins and who loses, what are the appropriate institutional mechanisms, what should take place in those negotiations to ensure that the rural poor and those who are already living in those areas are not excluded. And so we, actually my colleague Ruth Meinzendick got some funding from the UK, the Environment and Social Research Council, to look into that for the cases of Ethiopia and Ghana. And so one thing that they did very early on is to classify what could be considered a private-public partnership and what not, and also to try to understand in those several cases that they're looking at in Ghana and Tanzania, to understand who has what role in these PPPs, especially at the setup, and very importantly, I highlighted those in red, who assumes which of the many risks that are obviously inherent in any agriculture production, and also who assumes the benefits. And if we don't have a balance of risks and benefits, so if the government bears all the benefits and the private sector bears all the risks, it's not going to work out. Or if the farmers bear all the risks and the private sector all the benefits, this is not going to last. So if we don't have the appropriate balance, and I think that's what this study is looking into. And so basically, based on the case studies that they're exploring in the two countries, they can then set up, who has which roles or who dominates in which of these components. And this is just an example of a so-called classic core estate outgrow model that's typically very often used in Africa. For example, so basically land is handed over to a private sector entity. The private sector entity runs that estate or large farm, but then goes back and might develop, either contracts with smallholders that could be on the farm, could be outside the farm, some contractual relationships, or for example, it could be 10,000 hectares given to the private sector. 1,000 of these hectares have to be developed for smallholders. So there's a lot of these examples. And so in many of those, basically, those are the relationships that we see. The farmers come in for some of the on-farm construction and obviously on the production side. But sometimes, most of the production is actually done directly by the private sector, employing, some of the former farmers. Usually not a very large number. So one example that we've been looking into is in the so-called Southern Agriculture Growth Corridor of Tanzania, which itself is a PPP. It's a huge one, launched in 2011 at the World Economic Forum, starting with 350,000 hectares, but there's plans to put up to 6.6 million hectares under these schemes. It's co-chaired by the Tanzanian Minister of Agriculture and the Vice President from Unilever, and there's a very large number of private sector entities behind it. But not only that, there's also governments behind it, development banks, so it's a very powerful, very strong initiative. Within that, so there's individual private-public partnership arrangements, developments, many of them still under development. So the focus of the Tanzanian one is really, they say very explicitly they want international agro-industrial development, really get this rural development off the ground as fast as possible, not wait a couple generations, really bring in the private sector, develop things very quickly, for both food security, foreign exchange, benefits also obviously to increase tax revenues, both for the Ministry of Land and Ministry of Finance. So one challenge already is with the overall SACOT area is, where is the land? And there seemed to be some disagreement if there's land sitting around idle, as the developers seem to think, and land that's actually being farmed, but maybe not, it doesn't look like a modern industrial farm. And so actually most of the land that is planned for this kind of schemes would have to be freed up from what is currently village land. So they would have to change it from village land into general land. General land can be developed. So they somehow have to get it out of the villages. So that is a process. But there's this one Quilombero plantation that has gone much further than most of the other areas. And the background is that there has been a farm for a very long time. It goes back to the North Korea Tanzania Agriculture Company. So Nyerere and was a good friend of the back then North Korean leader and invited North Korea to develop a model farm there with about 5,800 hectares. It was done, but the whole thing became defunct in the early 1990s. To do the original model farm, they already got rid, expelled all the farmers that were there. When the thing became defunct in 93, the farmers came back. And then, of course, then the modern Sakot development came in, and the Quilombero plantation, largely UK investment, said, okay, we take it up, we'll really finally develop this model farm. And the farmers, some farmers had come back, so they had to again, they called them squatters, and obviously the locals said, no, we just came back. Some actually said they paid to come back. They paid again for the land, but according to the government, this land belonged to the Quilombero. So, but obviously, is a private sector, UK, so they actually couldn't just, they did not throw them out, so they resettled them. There were a lot of challenges, so 2.5 years just to get the land transfer titles, anyways, through the system. They wanted to grow lots of oil palm, that didn't go through. So they did focus on rice. They are inside a Ramsar site. So it's a challenging operation from environmental perspective, but they have really gone through with it, and they're now consider themselves to be a leading, one of the largest rice producers in East Africa, because they do have the 5,800 hectares under rice. And there are still some challenges in terms of intensification, them being in the Ramsar site. And I was just told I don't have a lot of time left, so I'll actually skip that. This just shows the various entities that are in some ways associated with this Quilombero plantation. And blue is the plantation, and so we basically have various government ministries that have an interest for this to succeed. And I've already mentioned the Ministry of Land, Ministry of Finance, so they are very happy with the arrangement. Ministry of Water is on the sidelines. There's also a local government authority that's very closely associated with the Quilombero, with the arrangement, and then we have the farmers. And they have a little bit, so there are some local politicians that work with farmers to try to improve relationships. So there's a lot of action there, and it just is one of these many cases that we see on the ground. And just to summarize, what are some of the challenges in these PPPs? So the first one is, when these things start out, the ministries of agriculture really want food security. They want agricultural development. The private sector wants no risk, high return, and they want things to be smooth and to work out, and that there to be no such challenges as farmers being on the land. So there could be, there is already a challenge. The government usually wants food crops. Private sector often finds cash crops are more profitable. So we had this case in Quilombero where they also wanted to do a lot of oil palm, but in the end they were not able to do it, at least up to now. The second one, information on water availability and use. So they come in, and obviously first the talk is always about land, but these kind of developments that the private sector is interested in, and also the government is interested in, you need water. So you want to intensify, you need irrigation. There's often very limited information, especially on the groundwater side. How does this water look like under climate change, climate variability? So there's very limited information. And for example, this Quilombero one sits in a Ramsar site. So there's a lot of challenges, and a lot of the Sakot area has similar challenges. So how are these being negotiated, and who sits at the table? The third one is, so when we look at PPP for irrigation, there's always the focus on the infrastructure. But we are in sub-Saharan Africa, so even if you put the infrastructure in place, you might still not have the fertilizer, You might not have the input and output markets. You actually need someone to develop the roads. So there's so much more that you need to bring in. And the government and the private sector, I think, have to very clearly discuss that before they sign an agreement. And even, for example, the government might say, yes, we put the roads in. But private sector can't expect the roads will be there tomorrow, because then the government will look for another investor, and then on it goes. So there's a lot of these challenges, and that's also why any private sector entity who's in this has to be in there for the long term. As I mentioned, even the land transfer was already 2.5 years to get some titles settled. Land and water rights, clearly the Quilombeiro people were there. They had some customary land titles. They sometimes had stronger things. How these are being treated obviously is essential for future sustainability and to ensure that farmers and future generations of farmers are sufficiently happy with the arrangement. And while we have some guidelines on voluntary guidelines for tenure on the land side, we do not have that for water. So that's a very big remaining challenge. And again, it's certainly a challenge in this Tanzanian case study. The biggest challenge maybe is, where is the farmer? So those arrangements are usually done between the government and the private sector, and the farmers are not at the table. But at the end of the day, they bear the largest risk. If this thing goes badly, it's their life. And just to add that up, I was at a workshop yesterday, and we were also talking about irrigation investments, and we had a US expert who said, oh yeah, if the irrigation investment doesn't work out, the farmer goes broke. And we had an expert in Ethiopia who said, if the irrigation investment doesn't work out, the farmer dies. So, and this is maybe a bit extreme, but it's really, if the government and the private sector, if they throw the towel after a couple of years, for the farmer, the outcome is a lot worse than that. And then finally, there's a challenge is to build trust in all of these PPPs. Private sector believes the government is inefficient, corrupt, bureaucratic, doesn't understand the issues that the private sector faces. Government believes the private sector, is spooky, trying to work behind their back, brings in, these high-level lawyers who understand things much better, have much better capacity of handling such arrangements, and that they will lose out at the end of the day. And then we have the farmers who don't trust either one. They see someone coming in, they have not been consulted. So that is how a lot of these arrangements are currently being handled, how they take place. Almost none of the agreements is available online. There's a lot of secrecy, and it increases the levels of mistrust. So just to sum up, it is, it sounds all a little bit negative, but this Quilombeiro plantation is now one of the largest rice producers in East Africa, so they have achieved it. The question is, could they have achieved it better? I think the question is, how can we make sure that future such arrangements are being done in a more equitable way? I think that's the challenge, and that I leave you with. Thanks.
Now we have the Q&A part of this panel. If you can come here, maybe it's easier. Of the confluence of policies, institutions, technology, and I will add society. I think that's a very important, that's something that I learned, particularly the part of building trust, which was my original thought. Any questions from the audience, please? Yes, sir?
I'm curious as to why the small farmer is not engaged from the beginning in any and all
this. So in the Quilombeiro area, they had about 2,000 small farmers that were there, had come back after the first one failed. So it's basically a challenge. Tanzania also has some decentralization. So for the government, these farmers shouldn't have been there. They didn't exist because this farm was already government-owned land, so to say. And so I think for them, for the government, they were not there legally. So it shouldn't be an issue there was no reason to engage them because they were not supposed to be there. I think, for them, and also I guess the government sometimes has this, they think actually the farmers will love this. They want to obviously increase their knowledge. They want to get access to this. Maybe the contracts that the plantation will make. The plantation is employing staff, right? They run the farm themselves, but they're employing, obviously, local people. So they don't see the need or they don't see the benefit. They know that the farmers are often illiterate. So there's also a challenge in terms of, investment you actually would have to have a lot of community meetings, etc. So it would just slow things further down, and things are already take a long time. I think those are just some of the reasons that come to my mind. But there might be others, in the room who might have some ideas, or others at the table.
But there are examples in India of community growers who are effectively managing those communities very well. In fact, all of the needs of those communities. My experience has been that in a sustainable organic system, which is where I work most of the time, unless communities involved, unless it's centered around the needs of all, even in the old farms, even in China, and for that matter, other places where government-owned and controlled, still does in many cases, most of the land tenure becomes a critical issue. Communities are better at solving that issue.
But are you referring to a PPP kind of arrangement where the private sector is coming in? Yeah. Okay.
Private sector is much more
Efficient.
sustainability to those because there's market mechanisms.
Yeah. No, I mean, there's certainly, but we haven't, I think the case studies in Ghana and Tanzania, we haven't found this kind of more beneficial arrangement. But as I said, you have to look at both. So the rice is being produced now. So there are, and the government is getting more taxes from both land tax, other incomes. So there's a lot of input suppliers who are very happy, they can provide a lot of fertilizer. So there are a lot of things happening, and there is also some, obviously now, capacity building. Also it's very interesting because this plantation is a big entity, so they have been able to attract a lot of additional money for outreach programs with the farmers, etc. So they have, because they have become so big, so they have attracted additional financing, that definitely feeds back into the farm communities. So, yeah.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
On the gender and irrigation, I think it will be important to look deeper into the changes that will happen when irrigation is introduced with regard to the different other inputs besides the water. So the question would be, for example, will the women provide more labor as a result of the irrigation? And then, of course, husbands and wives will talk more, and there will be more common decision making if the labor is supposed to come then from the women, the additional labor. And similarly with the capital. So you would have to take kind of a broader view to get deeper insights, I would say.
Yeah, thank you for that. So in the two examples I showed from Tanzania and Ethiopia, we won't really be able to look at that too much because we're randomly selecting people who are already irrigating and people who aren't irrigating. But we're actually doing an experiment in Ghana where we're actually randomly introducing irrigation technologies. So we'll be able to look at some of those issues more closely. And in our Women's Empowerment in Agriculture Index, we ask questions about decision-making with regard to irrigation, as well as the question of time, which we think is really important. We ask how long you spend irrigating. So we'll be able to observe those changes over time and maybe even be able to attribute them because it is randomly introduced. So we'll definitely be looking into that. Thank you.
Hi. Thank you for your work. But the question is, with all those things that you're doing, what have you detected to be the real crucial problem for the farmers in Africa?
Who wants to take that question?
The one big problem. One big problem, or I guess I'll say access. So even if you, Access, yeah. So even if you are able to successfully introduce irrigation, I mean, you still need, if you want any kind of positive impacts for income, you still need to connect people, and not just connect people to markets, connect one farmer to a market. But if you have a kind of remote community where one person hooks up to a private market, I mean, that doesn't really help. You actually have to get farmers in that same community to be more coordinated, maybe even growing on the same schedule so that they can link up together to markets. So I think that's one of the main challenges.
Yeah, just to build on that, I'd say access to credit and access to information are really key issues that we see differential access to those two issues for different farming groups. And that's why we were looking at alternative ways. So if credit is an issue, I mean, even if there are ways that can open up more credit opportunities, are there alternatives like these irrigation service provider models where you wouldn't necessarily have to purchase something, but another way to get access to alternative mechanisms to access technologies to further your income opportunities? But yeah, I'd say access to information and technology and credit.
Yeah, I don't work in Africa, so I cannot directly answer. But if I look at India, I would think about unintended consequences of new technologies. So that's, I think, also one of the often a more longer-term problem. But I think that's also a serious problem.
So I'd say schooling, because if farmers can read, write, especially the women as well, not just the men. This will have dramatic consequences over time, because as these technologies are becoming more complex, I mean, what we also find with, farmers who NGOs are introducing irrigation technologies, but there's often, they've only done rain-fed and maybe some cereals, and now to be profitable with irrigation, they have to also add fertilizer, they have to grow vegetables. And then, yes, they can become quite well off, but this is a huge shift. And there's a capacity challenge, and to start on the capacity challenge, there's obviously a lot of things you can do on information, access to credit, etc. But actually, just basic education, give them the time to spend enough time in school to do that, because we need very highly educated farmers, not just in the West. We need them everywhere. And then just an example from Ethiopia, because it's really contextual. I mean, we talked with some farmers from Tigray there a little while ago, and they said, just get rid of the state, because that they have constant state interference. The state finds a new thing that works, that the state thinks works, like fertilizer, and then they impose it. And if you don't apply you don't apply what they tell you, then you might be really in trouble. Or if you don't put your small water harvesting scheme because the government said, according to our research, it works, if you don't put it, you're in trouble. And so you actually have to put it. So that's why we see a lot of disadoption of some of these technologies in Ethiopia, because there's too much state interference sometimes.
Any other? Okay, you want to?
I would say that.
Yeah, we need the microphone for the camera.
Oh, for the camera. Okay. So I would say that I used to do farmer to farmer, and I was in Ghana, I was in Togo, and, one time in Angola. But everywhere I go, it is not because the farmers can produce. It is because they have no access to the market. And it is a very painful proposition. After you teach the people how to grow, and you expose them to innovation, and so they can grow more, but they can't sell it. And trucks won't go to the villages. And I wish that, as we could carry this message to the same sources that are pushing irrigation as well.
My question is for probably all of you, either in India or in Africa. How do you see the likelihood of the investment in rain harvesting technology to be developed for those areas? No, not green. Rain harvesting. No, rain harvesting. Rain, yes, rain harvesting.
Who wants to start?
Well, I can just build a little bit on the example that we were studying in Madhya Pradesh, where that was a community that was pumping groundwater, and that was basically their only source, but the groundwater table was declining. So the provincial authorities started promoting this idea of rainwater harvesting, where farmers would invest money. And it just transformed the community, not only the farming community, but the larger community itself, the positive externalities that came from that, from improved production, but also improved employment. The communities around it, their economies started to grow as a result. And now they're seeing the groundwater table start to recharge because of this rainwater harvesting. I think that we see an opportunity to further upscale that particular model, but there are other models of rainwater harvesting as well. But this was a very positive alternative to what was the current situation in that community.
Yeah, the NGO we work with in India, one of the main focus is restoration programs, and so that is facilitating the rain harvesting, because so there will be improved capacity to capture the rainwater, and that's so that has been their main focus, and there are clear benefits to that, visible benefits, similar to what you addressed. So, but it's not sufficient. So it's yeah.
Yeah, just to maybe complement. So serious large-scale rainwater harvesting is intervention that takes time, so you will not have the benefit in year one. And you need a very large space, so you need so-called collective action. And so that's why it's either done through NGO or you need a government involvement. And so yes, there are those programs also, Ethiopia and a few other African countries that are ongoing and over time obviously provide some benefits, but there's also significant investment cost. There's also small-scale individual rainwater harvesting in many parts of Africa, but those are usually very labor-intensive, like to build the bunds and or even what they call it, the road runoff harvesting, etc. So there's a lot of these small-scale interventions, but those are more in more remote areas where you really just have absolutely nothing else. You don't have any electricity, you don't have a pump. Generally labor-intensive, but for survival, that's being done. So there's different types, and definitely as long as this is not going to go away, it's an important supplementary in investment. Yeah.
Well, it's more difficult to harvest rainwater with thatched roofs.
But now it's so much corrugated, look at what they have now. So you can do that as well. Rooftop.
This will be the last question because of time.
Okay, I'll make a comment and one maybe question. One in terms of a success story on PPP, particularly as it applies to Zimbabwe, in the sense that in the tobacco production, where you've got the main buyer, who are Chinese companies, working with peasant farmers in the production of tobacco, and then you have the government providing the enabling environment for these transactions to take place. You have about 100,000 small-scale farmers who collectively sell about $500 million worth of tobacco to China, simply because of that linkage, between the production and the market. The impact of that is that you're looking at a peasant who, 5 years ago, his total income was probably $500 a year. But because of this linkage, with the market, you're looking at $5,000, $10,000, and that's a lot of money. So basically, that's just an example of what I would consider a success story, regardless for the other politics, behind, Zimbabwean land reform and what have you. But I think it's a good example of where the PPP has worked, with each party playing their particular role. Then my question is, the studies you are talking about, it's in West Africa,
or possibly East Africa. One, you've got cultural differences, whether it's a patriarchal society or matriarchal society, that affects your decision-making process. Then two, the level of colonization also impacts on the mindset of the people, that are probably involved in the agricultural sector. When you look at Southern Africa, where there is a long history of commercial farming, then when you go to West Africa, the mode of interaction between the colonized and the local people was also different. My example, when I first went to West Africa, when somebody said, "Oh, come to my farm," I said, "Okay, let's go to your farm." And I see this patch of land, 100 meters, maybe 100 feet by 20 feet. In Southern Africa, you don't call that a farm. That's a plot. Then when you go down to Southern Africa, people are talking of, hectares and, whatever and so forth. So that, again, makes a big difference, in how you assess, the impact of whatever, technology or know-how, that you're going to.
Me? Yeah, no, I think that's a very good point. And one thing that we've done as part of these studies is do suitability analysis to look at the social, the biophysical, and the economic context in which we're looking at different interventions, because that's absolutely right, that there's no one silver bullet or no one, I think you even mentioned that too, no one size fits all. We've done also looking, just as you mentioned, just the gender differentiation, the different types of farming, if it's male-headed or female-headed, and how the different interventions may be adopted or not in different contexts. So I think that's a very important point, and one we're trying to better understand as we go forward. Yeah.
Yeah, and just to respond on what you said about the different household dynamics, so I think this will be a really interesting analysis for Ghana, because we have a lot of households that are polygamous. We have some households that are polygamous, but that might have 3 wives, and each of those wives has multiple children, and there might be like 2 even sons of a father. So you have these very, very interesting compound dynamics with these households of up to 30 or 40 people. So, I mean, looking at gender in a situation like that, I think will be very interesting, and how that impacts the nutritional status of the whole larger household. So.
Thank you very much to the panelists for this great discussion, and also the audience. And I would like to invite the panelists and everybody here to learn more about our journal, World Food Policy, that the Policy Studies Organization has. In fact, there is a World Policy Conference in Thailand next week, the first one, and we will try to disseminate more information, but please submit your papers. Is in collaboration with the Royal Society of Thailand. So it's World Policies, it's online, open access so far. Actually, I wanna, in the last when you are chatting between the 2 panels, I'll open the website so you can see it. Just go to ipsonet.org, the PSO website, and look for under journals, World Food Policy. It's a very young journal, but it's getting a very good audience and good impact factor. We're building it. So, but thank you very much. Let's join me to. No, you're welcome. And I noticed that we had more time, so I said we have such a great. Thank you for respecting the time. But then I decided to give you more time for the discussion, because it's the next panel is at 11, and it was so great. And you came all the way from Arizona, so and you were traveling too. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.